Hello SGD, Sacred Geometry Decoded, and this will be part 3, looking at the very curious nature of the number 55, how it's applied in ancient architecture, ancient weights and measures, and how in math, geometry, arithmetic and astronomy it's one of these beautiful numbers. So we'll be connecting it again to the ancients, but also as is applied in the more modern mystery schools, the esoteric, such as the Freemasons. So I began part 1, the Department of Lands buildings, Department of Lands by very important architect James Barnett here in Sydney, the front of the building on Bridge Street, and how we have, so it's a 5-story building, but so the ground level, but then we have 1, 2 and 3, and the first, so that's the Doric. Okay, so we can see Doric form of architecture, then Ionic form of architecture, and then Corinthian at the top. These are called the 3 schools of Greek architecture, very important in Freemasonry. So you see the Doric, Ionic and Corinthian boards, the 3 pillars. There's also the 5, which include 2 Roman, but the 3 Greek are the important ones for the moment. And so compass and square, but also the concept of measurement. This would be a very important feature. So even the square, we see it works as a ruler, and even on other boards where we have these the geometry instruments, but also the all-important measuring tool, which whether it was Noah using cubits or Gilgamesh using cubits in the preserver of life, very important. There's no science, there's no architecture without these things. So the Department of Lands building, the main copper dome, which has a square base, 55 feet in diameter, so it's your link to 55, but will connect to the Great Pyramid, also ancient Mesopotamia and Babylonian specifically, but this would also apply to the Sumerian units of measurement. And so this symbol, the rod and the ring, various understandings of it, but one of the primary understandings is that it's a measuring cord and a measuring rod. It's a symbol of power. The powerful, the gods and the kings carry it. The gods and the kings, especially the kings and queens, are the people who define the law, but they also define standards of weights and measure. Whether it's you're paying tax, whether you're operating in a marketplace, the powerful, one of their primary most important job, especially in the ancient past, was to define standards of law, standards of weights and measurement. So the scepter and orb is essentially it's the same thing as a rod and a ring. Weights and measures and the power of defining those, but also how it would apply to stonemasonry and architecture and science in general. Even the word ruler, rulers or the rule of law, the ruler rules, but the ruler measures too. So there's one of the now connections, Thoth or Shesset, but Thoth, god of knowledge, he's also the god of weights and measures. So Hermes or Hermes Trismegistus, Mercurius, but Hermes or Mercury, gods of knowledge, gods of weights and measures as well. This crosses all the ancient cultures. I'll put a link in the description in regards to a series I did on measuring rods and the wand. So magic wand, but the caduceus of Hermes was an olive branch given to him as a gift by Apollo. The olive branch was a wand. In ancient Greek, wand translates to measuring rod. So even in the Bible, when they talk about New Jerusalem, or in the books of Enoch, they talk about the measure of an angel and using the measuring rod to measure. That's just so important. So rulers. Now, Washington Monument, so that has this embedded the Fibonacci, but the 55 feet as well. There are many plaques throughout, and from the Oddfellows, but also from the Masons. Now there's another Masonic plaque there. Grand Lodge of Maryland, you can see the compass and the square, but what's his figure? Well, it's they've blended two. Well, what do we have? Thoth, again, god of knowledge, god of weights and measures, ancient god related to architecture. So back to Bridge Street, Sydney, the Lands Department building and the copper dome there, 55 feet wide. Now the classic compass and square of the Masons. Now, very important tool. And now, for instance, we have the square, which is half of a square. So 45, 45, and 90 degrees. Very important in Freemasonry and esoteric schools in general is Pythagorean theorem. Here we see the 3, 4, 5 triangle. A squared plus B squared equals C squared. 3 squared plus 4 squared equals 5 squared. That's why the 3, 4, 5 triangle is so important. But any right angle triangle, you can apply Pythagorean theorem. So if each of the short edges, which are equal, because equal angles are 1, therefore the hypotenuse, or the long edge of the square, has to be the square root of 2. Square root of 2 is 1.412135562. Actually runs on, so I'm shortening it down, but if you can get to that 9 decimal places, you're doing very, very well. So the compass and the square, well, the square, it relates to this very important number, square root of 2. And even the compass and the square, LV in Roman numerals is 55, but the utility of this particular instrument, so the copper dome here is a square of 55 feet. Zoom in on it, and 55 by 55 feet. So now we can use the square, or the knowledge of the square, to find out the diagonal length. So from corner to corner, that's x, let's call it. So therefore, x equals 55 feet times the square root of 2, which is 77.7187 ... feet. So now we know the diagonal of that square. Back to the Great Pyramid, 440 Egyptian royal cubits at the base. Again, that's the average, but 440 cubits is you're within a few centimeters. I've covered that in regards to the variations on each side, but even so, the old borderland mapping, such as this very curious Perry Reese map, which shows parts of the world which apparently weren't discovered for some time after the printing of this map. But you'll notice that the mapping style is not yet classic like as we have now, longitude and latitude. They're using these rosettes, and that geometry creates 32 points around the 33rd. I'll link, like previous episode I mentioned that, I'll link those in the description again, but the importance 33 and 32, for instance, 32 in the Scottish Rite and 33rd by invitation. 33 very important in esoteric, especially Freemasons as well. But that of course leads to the pyramid. So just like the borderland mapping system, if I take the pyramid one base and I divide it by 2, I get 440 divided by 2 is 220, then 110, and then 55. I can't divide less than 55 without going into fractions. So 55, of course, it's the second and measuring the angle using 5.5. So I mentioned that earlier. So that is connections as well. But the Egyptian royal cubit, pi over 6 meters, 0.523599 meters. That turns out to be 1.71784375 English feet is one Egyptian royal cubit, pi over 6 meters. The Babylonian royal scale of 1.1 English foot equals 1 Babylonian royal foot. That's also the same as the Indus Valley foot. That's also the same as the Saxon foot, which was there just before the more modern English foot instituted during the time of Queen Elizabeth I. But the way they divide, so just like now, unlike the Egyptians, which did not have 1.5 feet equaling a cubit, but the Babylonians did define a cubit as 1.5 feet. Each foot was made of 20 fingers, and each finger was made of 6 grains. So 55 Egyptian royal cubits equals 1,717.843752 Royal Babylonian fingers, and 1 Egyptian royal cubit equals 1.71784353752 feet. Exactly the same number, just multiplied by 1,000. And I'm repeating that from the last one because I'm going to come back to it now, because this square of 55 feet therefore has a diagonal of 77.7817 etc. feet. Well, remember, the number of feet per Egyptian royal cubits times 1,000 equals the number of Royal Babylonian fingers per 55 Egyptian royal cubits. And it just so happens that 77.78174, etc. English feet equals 1,414.213562 Royal Babylonian fingers. Royal Babylonian fingers again. Well, what's the square root of 2? 1.414213562. Precisely the same number. Once again, we just multiply it by 1,000. This is it's been embedded in ancient architecture. It's been passed on through, whether it's just residual repetition, but I would think that there are those who know and understand it, and that's why buildings such as these and these all-important architects, whether it's in the more modern era, I.M. Pei or Norman Foster, or whether in the past in Australia, people such as James Barnett designed these things, both with symbols, but also with very important special measurements. I already went through the importance of 55 in previous episodes, but, well, another example, so Great Pyramid, most you can see the pyramid is 2 sides, so 440 Egyptian royal cubits times 2, 880, 280 Egyptian royal cubits high, that reduces to 22 wide at the corner and 7 high. 22 over 7 is the best whole number, or one of the best. It's, if you're working in any sort of engineering field, 22 over 7 is more than good enough. On paper you want the perfect pi, but 22 over 7 is pi. In real world applications, that estimate is as good as gold, because pi is transcendental. It runs on forever and ever. No one's actually worked out the exact value of pi. No one ever will. It just goes on for infinity. So for those who are sticklers to that particular pi, well, good luck. Now, what's interesting is that 55 feet is 31.42857.142.857 repeater in Cremona cubits. Now, the Cremona foot is 6 Cremona is 7 English. It's one of these things which appeared in older texts, such as commercial guides for people in commerce need to know their weights and measures. This particular book listed all the various regional weights and measures, but it's fallen out. It's a very curious thing. But 6 Cremona equals 7 English, 55 feet equals 22 over 7 times 10. Times 1,000 times 10, also times 100 throughout the pyramid in its distance from the pyramid to Heliopolis, or the angle which defines the Nile Delta is the angle of the pyramid, and it's the size of a pyramid times 1,000. Times 10, times 100, times 1,000, so many aspects in regards to ancient architecture and these other things. So 55 feet, the diagonal of the square is square root of 2 times 1,000 Royal Babylonian fingers. 55 Egyptian royal cubits is the number of English feet in an Egyptian royal cubit is times 1,000 is the number of Babylonian royal fingers in 55 Egyptian royal cubits. 55 feet in this Cremona scale gives us the dimensions of the pyramid and one of the better whole number approximates of pi. So this building, Lands Department, is here in Sydney, and that's where it is, and that's where it's going on. And now approaching 15 minutes, but there's a lot more going on in regards to this, and one of the examples would be the Sydney Harbour Bridge, and I'll leave it at that for the moment and do that in the next part, because it's quite an intricate system of the modern and the ancient, and weights and measures, Thoth, Sheshet, Hermes, Mercury, and even the Babylonian systems, even the Indus Valley systems as well. With that, cheers, have a good one, more to come.